Hello and welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today I have some more armor testing for you. Over this last weekend, I was at Harvest Fest in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I was able to put on my armor and do a bunch of cool tests to try out some things that I had been thinking about when I had started doing some of my other armor tests, specifically with the Mordhau. And this particular video clip, I'm going over the Greatsword or the Montante. Now, somebody at this sparring camp this weekend had two different kinds of Montantes. They had a more typical Spadone kind of Montante, which is basically like a 42-inch blade or a 44-inch blade and maybe about 5-6 pounds, which, if you know anything about long swords, is just a little bit longer and just a little bit heavier. And it had that nice ring guard, but I wanted to make sure to try this out on the VB Montante, which, if you know anything about that, is another couple inches longer and another pound heavier. So this one clocked in, I think, at almost 50 inches of blade, or at least overall height, and definitely had like a good 7 or 8 pounds on it. So it was easily the biggest sword I was going to get a hold of that's at least somewhat representative of a historical model, and I wanted to see how much damage it could do to my armor. So first up, we started off by having Frank, my friend here, load up and just throw some shots at my torso. And as you can see, pain-wise, it was pretty much negligible. It didn't do a single thing. But one thing that is interesting to note is that you can see as it hits me how much force is being transferred and how it's kind of able to knock me back a little bit. This is important to note because this is something that a longsword can't do with a similar kind of test. And most importantly, something that in the Mordhau videos, you can see something similar where some force is really being transferred. But in this particular case, because the weight of the blade is so much higher, you can almost get a similar kind of percussive effect. Now, against the chest, again, obviously, it's not going to do much of anything, and I didn't expect it to. But when we moved on from there, we moved on to hitting me in the head, just like with the Mordhaus. And one thing I thought was really interesting here is that this 7-pound Montante was able to do a similar kind of force and damage to my head at a maybe similar percentage to the Mordhau from the test a few videos ago. And that test, I probably got to about 60, 70, maybe even a little higher percent before it had started to, give me a little bit of pain and jostle my teeth around. And so it became uncomfortable. Obviously, I stopped the test at a similar point here, and it's important to note that we once again got to that 60-70% range before the Montante was starting to do some damage to me. And this is an important thing to find because what it tells me is that the reason you want to do a Mordhau style technique is that it better shifts the weight and the velocity into a part of the sword that is going to have better transference, but it can't meaningfully change the weight of the sword. At the end of the day, a longsword is still a longsword, and a 4-pound object, even if you're using the best possible spot, can't transfer all that much force. But a 7-pound Montante suddenly, even though you're using arguably one of the worst parts of the sword for transferring force, was able to get a similar amount of damage out of me and pain without sacrificing any range or having to go into a goofy grip. So what this tells me is that generally, overall, maybe my understanding of the Montante as not being this like big hulking thing or as effective as a polearm may not be as true as I once thought, though it is most important to note here that just because it was able to harm me doesn't mean that it would be able to necessarily knock me out or anything. Remember, I'm having to stop these tests well before I get to the point of experiencing any kind of real significant pain, which means that while technically speaking, Frank could have revved all the way up to 100% and done some kind of twirl beforehand to get, maybe 110%, he probably still wouldn't have been able to knock me out so much as he would have been able to dent or even harm my head to the point of making me bleed, which, as you see here, actually did end up happening. The crest of my mask came down with such a bend that it actually managed to nick my nose and caused me to bleed a little bit. And what I want people to understand here is that the idea of being knocked out in armor in a lot of ways requires a very particular kind of force angle as opposed to just raw force. Knocking somebody out by hitting them on the top of the head, even though that might not be something you do with a Montante a whole lot, takes a lot more than it is to get that kind of torque you need to knock somebody out, which is why boxers will often target the chin. My understanding here is that while maybe this Montante would have been able to deliver a significant amount of pain to me, it wouldn't have been able to knock me out because it wouldn't have been able to turn my head enough to make my brain rattle around inside my skull. Instead, what it might have been able to do was hit me hard enough to push my helmet down into my head and then still have enough force left over to crack or damage my skull, at which point I would definitely believe that you would be able to harm me, but kill me would definitely be a tall order. As a bit of a change of pace, the next thing I wanted to test in my armor was push kicks. This might seem a little bit weird, but if you know anything about historical manuals, you know that sometimes there is a bunch of kicks or weird unarmed techniques that are thrown into these manuals without really any indication of how effective they might be. And I wanted to know, for example, like a Talhofer kick or a Fiore kick, whether or not these things are supposed to be in there for the armored portion of these treatises rather than the unarmored portion. We can imagine what it feels like to get kicked in the belly, but in an unarmored sword fight where both people aren't wearing armor, throwing your leg out there for what is essentially a Hail Mary kick to the belly doesn't seem like as effective an option as, well, hitting them with the sword. But theoretically, maybe if doing these kinds of push kicks affects somebody in armor a lot more than hitting them with the sword, maybe it becomes viable again. But what you're probably seeing from the footage here is that actually the armor is just as effective at dispelling force from the front from a kick as it is from a sword. And the result here is that if you've ever been push kicked in something like karate or Muay Thai, you know that if you kind of harden up your abs and go with the flow a little bit and let yourself rock backwards, you can take off a lot of the stank that these kicks can have. And the armor, in effect, acts as the ultimate form of ab training, where you're just flat out never going to actually penetrate my front area because of the steel. And as a result, it pushes that force into the rest of my body and my hips and my shoulders, which makes it really, really nice and comfortable for me, as opposed to the person throwing the kick. However, as you see sometimes later on here where I start walking into the kicks, it actually ends up starting to force my opponent backwards, despite the fact that they're able to kick far harder than I can walk forward. The fact that the armor gives them such a kind of good stopping point and a good point to push off of means that a whole lot of the force of their kick ends up going back into them rather than into me. So overall, I'd say that if you were ever wondering whether or not kicking a guy in armor would do anything, I'm going to say that no, it's not really going to do anything. And most importantly, it's not really going to do anything more than hitting them with a sword would do. So just try to stab instead. The next thing I wanted to test here were joint locks. Now, if you read sources, much like with the push kick, you will probably recognize some of these locks from historical sources such as Fiore. And one thing I wanted to know going into this is whether or not these locks would be effective at actually breaking my joints, or if they were only used as kind of holds or lock positions. Now, obviously, when you watch some of these, you're going to say, oh, well, no, duh, you couldn't actually manage to break an arm. Something like an arm bar isn't going to work because the plates in my van braces and my elbows are going to lock, and you won't be able to bend steel any harder than you can bend anything else. So you're going to get stuck, and that's true. However, one thing I want to point out is that in every one of these positions, despite the fact that I was completely unharmed, and no matter how hard my training partners here tried to break my joints, they were completely unable to get them past any meaningful range of motion. They were able to hold me in that position somewhat effectively. As it turns out, being put in a compromised position doesn't just put you in a state where you can't get out of the hold, but also one where you have to make sure that you can't necessarily just get up at all. Looking at like the armbar position that Frank puts me in, or the figure 4 that John puts me in, it's or the chicken wing position, which is another interesting one. It's a situation where there's really no ability for anyone to harm you, but you can't use your arm. And especially the chicken wing one, where the person is behind you, this would be a really effective way to capture a knight. So if we go back to the historical sources and we want to wonder why they would bother teaching you these joint locks when you can't break a knight's joints, the answer to me seems to be that, well, you don't really want to use these to break a knight's joints. You specifically want to use them to hold them down so that they can be captured and ransomed later. At which point, the fact that you can't harm them becomes not a bug, but a feature. Now you can effectively do a lot more violent things to a knight's joints, knowing that you don't actually have to worry about harming them by accident or killing them because their broken bones are going to give them sepsis or something. Instead, you can just go buck wild and start throwing crap at people's elbows and shoulders and fingers even, and not really have to worry about doing real harm, but putting them in a position where you can capture them with your friends. A pretty illuminating study, and one that I think not a lot of people put a lot of credence into, because I think some people go into the historical sources and they start seeing things like BJJ arm bars and locks, and they assume, oh, well, it must work exactly the same as in BJJ, where it sort of does, but also given this complete change in prioritization and the fact that you can't do any damage, you'd probably end up doing some things that would never work in BJJ, but might work out here on the armored battlefield. So to sum up a bit, you'll often see in Boo Hurt and other MMA, medieval MMA leagues where they allow kicks and punches and, all kinds of grappling. And you might wonder about whether or not that kind of stuff is effective. And to that, I would point out that when you compare and contrast the fact that a real, well, maybe even oversized montante is able to harm me by hitting me in just the right spots, whereas these push kicks, these joint locks, and probably punches and kicks to the head, in other places, really aren't going to do the same kind of damage. What you have to come to understand is that a lot of these things are put into those promotions for the purpose of entertaining the crowd, and specifically not because they are effective. Because if you were able to knock me out through my helmet with just a round kick to the head, where you couldn't harm me at all by, throwing a cut to my head, well then people wouldn't have really brought many swords to the battlefield, or at least not many hammers. But the fact that these things are even less effective than the weapon-based implements, it might seem like a bit of a no-brainer, but it is important to understand, because I think a lot of people are constantly watching things like Boo Hurt and medieval MMA, and they're starting to see these weird patterns where, thanks to the safety regulations and the armor that those fighters wear, they put themselves in situations where they're unable to thrust with their weapons, which means they can't actually meaningfully do harm to the person in armor. And suddenly, under these situations where your weapon is basically made useless, you see things like the punch shield start to shine, where it can do a little bit more damage than a punch or a kick, but it's also not a stabbing or cutting implement. And you might wonder, well, why would they put these things in there if they want to be historical? And the answer is they don't. They want to be entertaining. They want to show people knockouts and fun hits and lots of cool stuff. And you just saw from the push kicks, it is very dramatic looking when you kick a piece of steel armor, but it's also not very damaging. And this keeps the fighters safe, it keeps things entertaining, and keeps people happy. So I'm not trying to say that it's, garbage, but what I am trying to say is that you have to be very careful when you watch other kinds of armored fighting combat to know and understand what is and is not effective, because it can often lead to incorrect conclusions about what this means about history. But if you think I should get hit in the head even harder, feel free to write so down in the comments, and make sure to tell me about how I'm still wrong about greatswords, and I'll see you on Thursday.